So we've made it to the final session of the day, and I'm going to hand over in a second to Peter Swabey to chair this panel. As we know, it's quite a common feature in governance codes and governance frameworks to have a requirement for organisations to undertake regular board performance reviews, what was in old money board evaluations, but we're under new terminological times. So I think we're supposed to talk about board performance reviews now. Is that correct, Peter?
Yeah.
This is a good party line that I'm towing?
Yep, absolutely.
Okay, well, Peter's Director of Policy and Research at CGI. He's been heavily involved in the Institute's work around consultation work and also guidance and accreditation schemes that the Institute runs. As I mentioned this morning, there are some related materials to this session in the app and on the platform. So do have a dig around there, some good practice for both for people delivering board performance reviews and for those engaging reviewers. So I'll hand over to Peter, who is going to introduce the panel and discuss board performance reviews. Thank you, Peter.
Oh, well, good afternoon, everybody. Board performance reviews. I'm Policy and Research Director at the Chartered Governance Institute, and back in 2018, sorry, I'm conscious I've got my back to half the people over there, so I'll try and turn around a bit. Back in 2018, we were asked to do a review of board evaluations in the FTSE 350, which is obviously of no relevance to almost everybody here. But the reason for that was that the government was concerned about the quality of the provision of board performance review services. We changed the terminology to board performance reviews because what we found was that when people were talking about board evaluation, and this will probably resonate quite well in a sport audience, people were saying, what's my score? How do I compare with somebody else? And what we were thinking was that a board performance is about your individual board. It's not about how you compare with other boards. So that was the rationale for the terminology change that Craig mentioned. But yeah, there are an awful lot of organisations that you will find who do board performance reviews. It is fair to say that some of them are better than others, but I think that goes with every type of review, every type of consultancy you get. And what we're going to try and talk about today is a little bit about the process that you might go through to think about how you're going to go for a particular approach. What you might do in terms of the review itself. Is it going to be a full review of your board and its performance? Is it going to look at the committees of the board? Is it going to take on the views of individual directors? Is it going to assess individual directors? That's a choice up to you. There are providers who will provide all those sorts of things for you. So if we get underway, so if I can perhaps start with you, Rob. We are going to be passing the microphone along here because we're told that that's going to work better. So your board review came quite early in the piece after the BDO process. Yep. How did that work? How did that differ from what you'd seen in previous processes? What was it like for you?
Yeah, so I mean, it comes back to a point Barry made earlier today, which has been a bit of a theme today, but so defining the problem that you're trying to solve. And when we set out on the process of commissioning our external board performance review, we were taking account when we were writing that brief of the circumstances that we were under, and that was that we had just had via UK Sport our BDO finance and governance review delivered by Max, who's over there somewhere. And so that left us in a position to say, well, we've just had some assurance around this. It wasn't necessarily planned. It wasn't part of the external board performance review that we intended it to be. But it did mean that we didn't feel the need to focus on that so much. And so when we put together the brief for the board review, then we were much clearer in weighting it towards, what are our behaviours like? How are our ways of working? What's that sort of soft governance side of it versus the sort of hard governance process piece, which had already been fairly thoroughly reviewed as part of that BDO process. So we're able to tailor it quite nicely to figure out what we needed.
And what were the key sort of criteria that you were looking at when you were selecting someone?
I mean, obviously, it's for most people in the room, a project of this size is quite a significant investment. So we went through our procurement process, which obviously balances, firstly, cost, but then more broadly, it's what expertise do these people have? What is their proposed approach? How inclusive is it? How well is it going to engage the board? How well is it going to answer the questions that we need? And how practical can the outcomes be? So we put that process out to 5 or 6 different potential suppliers and narrowed it down. Ended up working with Roland, who's over the other side of the room, and the team at Governance United. And that was on the basis of, skills, cost, but also ultimately how well can that brief that we've lined out be delivered, and how much confidence can we have in it?
Brilliant, thank you. That tempts me very much to ask Roland how good a client you were, but I'm not going to ask that. Mark, you went about things in a quite a different way, and fetched up with a different model for doing your board performance review. Could you talk us through that a little bit? I mean, sort of what were the conversations that took place there? How did you think that through?
So in my role where I'm now at UK Coaching, we've been through this process twice. If I'm really honest, the first time round was because it was a requirement of the governance code for sport. We were, I wouldn't say disappointed, but we were underwhelmed by the outcome of a traditional process, whereby the board and some of the leadership in the organisation were interviewed as traditional. There was a subjective report written and presented back to the board, and it really didn't tell us anything different, and we spent what I consider to be an extortionate amount of money. So this time round, it wasn't all bad, by the way, but this time round, what we did, we went down the digital route, and most people in the audience probably think, oh, okay, so you just did a survey. But actually, the outcome was brilliant for a couple of reasons. The survey was online. So in terms of time effectiveness, because it's not just obviously the cost financial, but it's people's time. All of those interviews that took place were a lot of time for some of our board members who are quite busy people, leadership who are trying to run the business. So we did a digital review, which asked some brilliant questions, and it was numerical, so it was objective, not subjective, and the results were really interesting, and they really brought some things that were otherwise unspoken, because when you get interviewed, often you speak quite positively about everything that's going on, but actually when you're putting an anonymous survey together, you can be really brutal, and it also asks you, depending on the score you give, to give verbatim comments as to why you've scored a certain way. So out of that came a report that were themes, and they raised some of the themes that were really good, but they also raised some of the themes where we could be better. And the scoring, which was really interesting, differed quite a lot between the non-exec directors and particularly the leadership team. And it was those conversations that were horrendously uncomfortable, but really enlightening. So I think it saved us in terms of time. It was, 80% cheaper than doing it the traditional way. And actually, the facilitator who took us through the results was outstanding and really helped probe the conversation that made a difference. So that's why we did.
Yep. No, and that's great. And I mean, there's some really interesting things come out there. I mean, we were shocked when we did the review for government all those years ago about the varying costs. If I tell you that there's one FTSE 100 company that paid £250,000 for their board evaluation. Now, I'm sure most of you will be quite happy doing that. And if you are, I've got a bridge I can sell you. So yeah, but there is a vast range of costs. I think all I'd say on your first time out experience is that I wonder if that was something about the reviewer. We've quite often had feedback that those interview based ones can get quite into the weeds and can get good results. But yeah, you found that the questionnaire one worked really well for you, so that's great, and as you say, a lot cheaper. Final observation I'd make on that, I think, is that when we were setting off those reviews, we did quite a lot of research with academics, and your comment about the different ratings that the execs and non-execs had. That's really common. Don't beat yourself up about it. Andrew Kakabadze, late Andrew Kakabadze at Henley Business School, did a big piece of research on that with boards all over the world. And typically there was a 2 to 3 out of 10 difference between how the execs rated the non-execs and how the non-execs rated the non-execs, except in Australia, where I think from memory the figures were something like the non-execs rated themselves 8 out of 10 and the execs rated themselves 2 out of 10. I only hope that applies to their cricket team in a couple of months' time. But yeah, so it's not unusual, so don't feel too badly about that. And that's really interesting. And coming over to you, sort of, Jackie, on the other side a little bit, as the deliverer of these things, what are your impressions about the way in which people select? I mean, obviously they made the right decision because they selected you, but about the process that people go through to select a reviewer. To what extent do you feel, and no names, no pack drill, that they've thought about this in a constructive and supportive way, and that they've chosen you because you are the right person for their organisation?
Yeah, great question. I think there's loads of indicators right from the outset. I mean, really, as soon as you get the brief, you open the brief and you have a little read, and you can immediately tell just by the choice of vocabulary and words, are they doing this because it's compliance and they've got to do it, and that sort of oozes through the paperwork, to be honest, or are they really keen that this is a developmental tool they want to explore, they want to better understand. So that really matters. So I think the choice of words and the phrasing matters. I think as a consultant, I would also look at to what extent there's some wiggle room in there, because as you go through that, you just don't know what you're going to find. So the ability to not be overly prescriptive. I'm always interested in things like, as a consultant, can I do the brief? Can I do what it is you're hoping to do? So I'm not like, producing an underwhelming piece of work, Mark. So I'm always interested in the timelines, because they always get squeezed, because it always takes the organisation inevitably longer to get the brief out. So the timelines involved, the methodology. Are you comfortable with and familiar with the methodology? You can do, how do people want the report delivered? Is it just a report and, you're a faceless person, but can you go in and sense check your report with the organisation and say, do you recognise yourself in this report? I think that's quite important. And we've also talked about the rather thorny subject, budget. A lot of briefs comes out with no budget, and it's a bit like job descriptions with no budget. As a consultant, it is helpful to give an indicative range, because how I put together my proposal will be very different if it's 3 to 5K or it's 6 to 8K or 10 to 12. So I think, to avoid wasting people's time, just give some sort of an indicative budget. And I think the other thing that I'm always interested in is who's the client? Because a lot of the time I may be asked to go in to do a board evaluation. Maybe it's the Sports Council who's asked me to go in and have a little look at one of the organisations they're invested in. Or maybe it's an NGB who's asked me to go in and look at a region or a club. And so I'm saying, okay, well, you're funding the piece of work, but who is my client? Who am I contracting with? And who's going to receive that report? So sometimes there's some confusion around that. So I think it's really just, the clarity of making sure that as a consultant, I feel I can add value and I can deliver value, really. So there's enough indicators through the process.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. And I think the question about what somebody is doing it for is absolutely fundamental to this piece, because there's a big difference between doing it because you feel you've got to, and doing it because you feel it will actually add value and make the board be better, or will help the board be better. One of the things that we see in the financial services sector is that the regulator has got the ability to do what they call a Section 166 review, which is where they appoint a board reviewer that you then have to pay for and don't have any choice about who it is or about what the budget is. But hey, they're the regulator, they can do that. That's not a clue for Sports England, by the way. But then it's almost it's a board reviewer's punishment almost, and that, for me, that just doesn't work. So that's really interesting about the way that you've gone about picking somebody, the way that you've selected. Any other thoughts, Rob or Mark particularly, that you would like to throw in at that point about the selection process? Yep.
Yeah, I would just say that I know we went down the digital route, but our interviews, we had 4 or 5 organisations that we looked at. We had conversations with the facilitator because even though the results were accumulated through a digital survey, it was the facilitation that really made the difference. So it's still a people assessment. I think the other thing probably is just to add that a lot of the leadership team and board were assessed as a collective leadership team. So there was some differences in the scoring, but ultimately it looked at not governance not so much, but the leadership of the organisation.
And again, that's a great point because, you know, I sometimes get told off for saying this, but I do see the board as a team. And when we talk about boardroom diversity, one of the things for me is, well, actually, you don't want a board of sort of 8 wicket keepers. Given that we're here, I was going to say goalkeepers, but hey, 8 wicket keepers. You don't want that. You want different varieties of skills, and you want people to work together as a team. So that's really important. In terms of the process, I mean, what practical steps did you see were necessary to prepare for this process? How did you go about that? I mean, so one obvious one that strikes me is buy-in from the board, because presumably if they're anti, it's not going to be as successful. Deb, do you want to start, Rob?
Come in there. So I mean, obviously we know that the code tells us that we have to do this externally facilitated board review every 4 years. My experience is saying that the code says we have to do it is not a compelling argument for the board. And so engaging them early in the process. And so from the point where we were writing the brief, not engaging the whole board, but making sure that the chair, vice chair, Sid, and our CEO were involved in that process and had the opportunity to feed in, making sure that they had the opportunity to review the procurement process, and that decision meant that they were on board and bought in from an early stage. And once they're on board, it makes it an awful lot easier to get the rest of the board on side and sort of bought into doing it. And, you know, in the context we're talking about earlier, there was some explaining as to why the BDO Finance and Governance Assurance Review was different to this review, and why they both needed to be done, and why they were different, and, you know, what the benefits were. So really selling that early helped, I think, the process to be delivered a bit more smoothly and with more buy-in, as you say.
Thank you. Mark, anything to add on that?
I guess from the first review that we did, our governance audit and risk team, they did an inordinate amount of work to understand what we did like and what we didn't like. They were then quite heavily involved in the brief. But in terms of selling it to the board, it's easy for us. We're a learning organisation. So the board are kind of bought into developing. And I think they saw it as a leadership assessment tool as opposed to a compliance thing. So it was an easy sell for us.
Yeah, it's good. Jackie, how's your experience on that?
I think sometimes you get so wrapped up in a point in the getting a great brief, you appoint your consultant, and then the consultant comes in, and I think the first thing the consultant will inevitably do is they need access to information. And sometimes people think, oh my God. So, you know, you just got to be ready to get that information ready to send out, or whether you're giving the consultant access to a digital platform. But the first thing we will request is a bunch of paperwork. And that's first impressions also matter to us. So, you know, we'll always be looking at, you know, the last year's worth of, you know, minutes, agendas, board papers. We want to see your governance documentation. We want to see your risk register. We want to see your succession plan. We want to see your governance calendar. You know, so I think that level of preparation, but that level of preparation takes an awful lot of time and effort. Yeah. And so I think thinking about that is absolutely key.
Yeah, and I think also if somebody looks a bit blank when you mention one of those things, that's also a bit of a clue about some of the things they might do. I mean, yeah, sort of on one of those points, I mean, I know one of the really, really big board performance reviewers, they insist on having an interview with the chairman as part of the recruitment process. And it's almost as though they're interviewing you rather than you as the organisation are interviewing them. If they're not satisfied that the chairman really, really wants a board review, they won't tender. And they're in a position where they can do that, which is kind of lucky, really. Yeah. But it goes, I think, to the importance of having the chair on board with this. Attitudes. Do you find, Jackie, that different organisations, different people you're interviewing have different attitudes to to what we're doing here, to the board performance review?
I think generally people are positive. Well, I'd like to think so. Yeah, generally people are positive. Sometimes people are a little bit fearful. And I have been in situations whereby the chair would say, look, as part of this process, I'll be really interested in your thoughts of the performance of the CEO. And I'll go, hold on a minute, that's not what this is about. So, so I think it's been really clear about what are we all here collectively to do, and what is this also, what are we not here to do? But I think generally people are positive. People have put time and energy and finance into conducting the brief, but generally the chair and the CEO are supportive. But as you go through the process, Mark's already alluded to, sometimes, if you give people a forum, there may be disgruntled board members who aren't happy with the way things are going. And sometimes it can become a little bit of a counselling session. And you need to hear what it is they've got to say, because in the middle of all of that, there may be some really good points. So through that process, whereby confidentiality, you need to be assured, and anonymity, things can start to crop up through the process. But generally, I think the people in charge tend to be positive, but sometimes the board members can use it as an opportunity to share some of their frustrations.
Yeah, certainly one of my former colleagues who did board performance reviews for many years, one of his favourite questions, his first question in any interview was, something along the lines of, tell me, on your board, who would you say is the best performing director, the director who contributes most? And what he found was that 9 times out of 10, they might name somebody, but then they would invariably say, but old Fred's completely useless. And yeah, that's fine. I mean, people have their opinions and things like that. On the other hand, if every single board member, with the possible exception of Fred, says, yeah, but old Fred's a bit useless, then that's a message that, and you're not necessarily looking for that, but that might be something that's quite important for the chair to know, because the chair might think that. But I don't know about you, but my experience has always been in an organisation that you, as the governance professional, can tell people time and time and time again, but if they get an external consultant telling them, well, that's clearly right. So I think that sometimes can help you. Mark, anything you'd like to add on the process?
I'm going to be really honest. It allowed us to whinge as an exec.
Yeah.
One of the outcomes was there were 3 areas that we scored lower. One was on accountability, and we raised the fact that quite often there would be several board members that hadn't read the papers, and it was really evident. Yeah. So it was a really awkward conversation when it was brought up between the leadership and the board with the facilitator, but actually we were able to table something that allowed us that forum to do that. And there was a commitment around accountability for the board to make sure they read papers before they come to a board meeting, because we spend an inordinate amount of time preparing them. Flip side, as an executive, we all know that our raison d'etre is here for the coach. We'll just be there to support the coach. But the board said, we don't really understand what that means, though. And we've got a trading arm and a charity. So what they said was, okay, well, fair dues, but what's the difference between the two? So we've ended up rewriting our mission statements for our trading arm and our charity. So it's really clear that there's 2 different sort of outcomes for those 2 different entities. So it really did work.
These things are a great boon for that, because I'm not giving the game away here, I hope, but you can set these things so you can see when people have looked at their board pack and how long they've spent looking at their board pack. And that can be quite interesting. You can't do that with paper. So there's another reason for saving the planet and moving away from paper. Can we talk about results a little bit? Conscious of time and that we don't want to keep people here too long because they've got places to go. Reporting, to what extent do you find it useful? To what extent do you feel that you are required to report on the results of your board performance review? And Mark, as you've got the microphone, do you mind going first?
Report to whom? So
to anybody.
We see the processes for ourselves first and foremost. We've got no problem sharing that with one of our major funders, which is Sport England. But we haven't proactively said to Sport England, and that way Lucy's still in the room, but you're welcome to look at it. But we really saw it as an internal process for us more than anything.
What? Rob?
Yeah, I mean, likewise, it was primarily for our benefit. We certainly felt, I guess, the need to be transparent with our members and the importance to at least say, we have done this and these are some of the headlines and this is some of the stuff we're working on. So we do include it in our annual report, both the the fact that we're doing our regular annual reviews, but also the external board review, just to share, we've done it, and these are some of the headlines that we'll be working on.
Yeah, thanks. And Jackie, what's the experience you have of your clients reporting on it?
So it really matters to me that it is of value. So ideally, I like to go and present the report or talk about the draft and sense check it and ask the question, do they recognise themselves in this report? Inevitably, you need to lead them with some sort of priority actions. So I like to go back in 3-6 months and ask for some feedback, reflections, was it of value, but also to what extent some of those have moved on. So I think that's important as part of that developmental tool.
And the question, I suppose, we'll start at that end as you've got the mic. But to what extent do you think there are practical steps that organisations should take about actioning findings, and how do you support them in actioning their findings or actioning the findings that you've made?
I think it's really important they own their report. So whilst I may go in and talk about high, medium and low priority, inevitably I would have discussed that with the board or the SID or the governance lead, because I think it's a priority, it may not be a priority for them. So through the dialogue, I think they need to own their report, they need to recognise it, but then they need to do something with it.
Yeah. Okay. Rob?
Yeah, so we took that approach once we presented it back to the board and got, thankfully, good agreement that the report was reflective. We then set up a small working group, myself, the SID, the vice chair, to establish an action plan. And I think it was quite important to do that quite quickly, just to keep the momentum going, but to establish the action plan. But it's something that we're still working on.
The Mark.
Yeah, similarly, our chair took it on, who's a business coach as well, so she took it on to come into the leadership team, but we had a wider leadership team, so we had a lot of the leaders in the organisation that I suppose have an impact on what we do and how we do it, so it was actually cascaded into some of that leadership team as well, share the results, and as a point, we have action plans on that, and I know my chair, she's a lawyer, so she'll definitely hold us to task.
Yeah, excellent. I mean, I think that's one of the really important things. I mean, certainly we see in some other sectors where people have to put something in their annual report because the stakeholders will expect it, and it's really interesting sometimes how bland some of those statements can be, and then sometimes you see organisations who have really added value and demonstrated the added value they've got. Conscious of time, we've got about 5 minutes left. If anybody's got any burning questions, this is the time to consider sticking your hand up.
At the back, he's taking away my microphone.
So there was a question at the back.
Hi. This is a question mainly for Jackie, but hi, Jackie. You talked about who the client is, and obviously you talked around if someone else is paying for the review, but I'm interested in who the client is when it's just the organisation, because if some of us here as governance leads have got some pretty strong views about what we'd like some of the outcomes of the board effectiveness review to be, are we the client as a governance lead or the chair, or how does that work from a dynamic perspective?
Interesting question, Joy, as I'd expect. I see the client as the chair. So that's who I would... those are questions I ask at the very first meeting, because inevitably at the first meeting, there's the CEO, there's the chair and the governance lead. So once I've established this is the organisation, I'll say, who am I authoring this for? But it's for the board. So I would say this is a report that should go back to the full board, and the board is led by the chair. But I think it's really important that should there, as I go through the process, I speak to the governance lead, I speak to the SID, I speak to the executive team. So I certainly, if the chair said I would like aspects removed or edited, sometimes that can result in quite fiery discussions, because I think it's really important I present the whole methodology and what I've seen. So therefore, the chair and the board are the client, but it's important that all aspects of the methodology is reflected.
Brilliant, thank you. Sam's still got the microphone. Any more questions? Anybody want to add anything to what Jackie said?
Yes, Joey, please.
Oh, thinking of the question.
Hi, possibly a daft question, but how broad is the interview process? I mean, are you only talking to the board members themselves? Do you engage with exec members or leadership teams? Do you speak to any key stakeholders?
So certainly in our case, it was all of the board members, all of the executive team, and then myself as the governance lead. So essentially everybody that attends board was involved in that process. And there was, I believe, slightly different questions asked of each stakeholder group, but broadly, everyone that attended board was spoken to. Peter?
Either of you want to come in? And what I would say is that it's up to you. It's up to you and the chair when you're defining the scope. I mean, that big FTSE company that I mentioned that paid the gross national product of Paraguay for their board review, I happen to know there were individual interviews there with each director, with each subsidiary board director, with the executive team at the top level, those people who would typically approach the board, with the auditor, and with various other external providers to get a picture of how they felt the board was performing. Got another one, Sam?
No, so there's time for one more if anyone has one. Oh, we've got an online one.
Well, Craig's got an online one.
My connection re-established just in time. So how would you manage poor delivery from a board if that comes through in the review? I guess that's in terms of implementing the results.
I'll start and I'll say, well, that's for the chair to sort out. And then I'll pass it on quickly.
I think it's a really interesting question. My first job when I first came into this organisation was to change some of the leadership on the board. I hope that the senior independent director at the time was going to do it, but it landed to myself as CEO. A bit of a bumpy time, but I think ultimately if you get the structure right, the governance structure in the board, you've got the chair. If the problem's with the chair, you've got the senior independent director. Otherwise, the chair leads it, and I think that's how it should be.
I think if the chair is the problem, you've got a big problem.
Yeah, that's what the SID's for, though, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Or should be.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, I'd agree with that. I think inevitably, if the problem gets so large, then it ends up going out to the members as the people you're ultimately accountable to. But I think we're all hoping that we'd never get that far.
That's great, thank you. Well, it's just gone, I can see a little clock here, and it's just gone over time. So I think if there are any other questions, I'm sure I'll certainly be hanging around for a little while. If anybody's got any questions they want to come to me with, that'd be great. If not, I guess thank you to the panel, and hand over to you, Craig.